Stephanie Rose.
Thank you. Hopefully,
You're not on. She's not on.
good afternoon. Can you hear me? See me? I'm not a podium person, so hopefully this works, as I am not going to use that stage. But I do want to make sure that everyone is able to come in the room and feels welcome. How are you all feeling so far? You've made it through half of the summit. Woo! We had an amazing opening, a wonderful welcome. We learned a lot of data about the statistics and what is going on across the country and things that are going on specifically here in Colorado. You all had your first breakout session. How did that go? Hopefully you were challenged. Hopefully at times you felt uncomfortable. And then hopefully you begin to feel restored even in the midst of the discomfort. So the title of my talk today, and I thought I would walk around the room, but they started the video camera and I see that there's no one guiding it, so I want to be respectful of our Rampart students who are recording. But the title of my conversation for today, and I am hoping that it is a conversation. I'm a Baptist pastor, so we do call and response. Amen? Amen. So the title of my conversation today is Recovering from Racism, Embracing Choices and Challenges. When you all see this picture, what do you see? Oh, thank you. Someone said beauty. Beautiful, thank you. A number of times when people see this picture, they often find it on my website or promotional materials, and they begin to see professor, they see pastor, they see author, and I do have books for sale. They see the CEO and founder of a business for our children's enterprises. But what they don't see is the narrative that has made me who I am. What they don't see shows up outside of the frame of this picture. One time I had a barbecue at my house and invited my entire church to come. Now, when I say I invited my entire church to come, let's just remember I have a congregation of 35 max on a good Sunday. So, and some of the young people brought their friends. And one of the girls from their high school came with them, and she was like, "Whoa, are you rich?" And I was like, "Not according to my bank account." But for her, there was something about the way I was living, something about the things I was able to achieve, something that registered to her not just success, but abundance. And let me tell you, it was not an easy road to get there. So as we think about recovering from racism, please keep in mind what it means to also embrace challenges and choices. I grew up in the 1980s on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. And so for me and many of us, the 1980s is the Cosby era. Like the Cosby Show was everything to me. And I just thought I was little Tempest Bledsoe. Like, that was my life. And when I grew up, I was going to become Claire Huxtable. Facts. I went to Clark Atlanta University to major in pre-law, possibly get a degree in English because I was going to become Claire Huxtable. But I also grew up in a space that was not always as encouraging or inviting as what The Cosby Show represented. Anyone ever heard of Dr. Margaret Burroughs? Show of hands. Dr. Margaret Burroughs. Dr. Margaret Burroughs is a was a visual artist, also an educator, a museum curator, and a poet. She was the co-founder of the first African-American museum in the country. Anybody know what that museum is? I see I'm out here in mountain country. But she was the co-founder of the DuSable Museum in Chicago with her husband, which they founded in their living room. And she wrote these words in 1968. "What shall I tell my children who are black of what it means to be a captive in this dark skin? What shall I tell my dear one, fruit of my womb, of how beautiful they are when everywhere they turn, they are faced with aberrance of everything that is black? The night is black, and so is the boogeyman. Villains are black with black hearts. A black cow gives no milk, a black hen lays no egg. Storm clouds black, black is evil, and evil is black, and devil's food is black. What shall I tell my children who are black?" How do you feel when you hear these words? What comes to mind when you hear these words? That devil's food is black, black is the night, boogeyman is black, storm clouds are black, a black hen lays no eggs. Does it sound like hope to you? Does it sound like, ooh, sign me up, that's what I want to be. I want to be black, just like that. So how do we create a world in which children are comfortable not just being black, being Latino, being Asian, being poor? How do we help them to not see themselves as buckwheat, as African booty scratchers? We laugh, but my brother who's standing in the middle of that picture, we used to joke at him because he was the darkest of us. And these names came out of our mouths even as I dreamed of becoming Claire Huxtable. Dr. Eddie Moore just did a presentation, a workshop that is a part of a longer workshop on the word nigger and its internalized oppressiveness in not just African Americans, but in all of us. And for those who missed that, he will be presenting again this afternoon. So I encourage you, if you can, go to his talk, his conversation. But what do we tell our children who are black, who are poor, who are disabled, who are Asian, who are Hispanic? What do we tell them, even as we desire for them to imagine the possibilities, to dream that they could be anything that they desire? We tell them first, in order to get there, you have to get outside of pickaninny, monkey, midnight, African, blue, black. So from the beginning of their lives, we tell them that there are hurdles you must cross, that there are chasms you must figure out how to navigate. When I was a third-year graduate student. I attended graduate school at Purdue University. Anybody know where Purdue University is? Woo! Go Boilermakers. Used to be all of this Big Ten stuff until Colorado switched. But I went to Purdue University in Lafayette, Indiana. Anybody know anything about Indiana and race? Got a couple of hands. What do you know about Indiana and race? So Gary is a very poor part of town, poor part of the state. That's where the Jacksons are from. Extreme poverty. Anybody else know anything about Indiana? Yes, in the back. Yes, absolutely. At one point, that's where the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan was, Joy. And when my father worked for UPS, he delivered to the Grand Dragon in Gary. That was part of his route. And we had to eat, because you just saw they had 5 kids, right? So we had to eat. And so he delivered to the Grand Dragon on his UPS route. So Indiana, in and of itself, has a history with racism that is tantamount and tangible all up and through the cornfields and the soybean plantations, because that's what they produce, corn and soybeans. So I was already in this space of historic and contemporary externalized racism. And in 2004, because graduate school for anyone is already one of the most traumatic experiences that one can go through, we look at the studies and the high rates of suicide for graduate students. So we tell you to overcome your challenges and make good choices, but no one tells you when you're applying to these wonderful opportunities, all of the things that exist outside of the frame. So I was already in a lot of pressure. I had finished my master's degree. I made the decision, embracing my challenges and choices. I made the decision to move from a traditional English program, which is what I got my master's in, to an American Studies program. And part of my decision-making process was telling myself I can only do this for the next 5 years of my life if I am able to connect with community. So one of the things that I learned in terms of recovering from racism is that I need to be deeply connected to community, to people who support me, to people who love me, to people who will encourage me when I feel as if the chasm is too much and too wide. So for all of our young people in the room, look around and determine now what you need your community to be like. So, having made this decision, I would travel on the weekends and the summers back to Chicago, Illinois, because it was only a 2.5-hour drive. Thankfully, I had a car, and I could get home. I had a place to stay. My parents hadn't turned my bedroom into an exercise room. Not that my dad would do that anyway. But, so I had a place to stay, and I would come home to be recharged. And one summer, the summer that I looked like this, I was at church. I went to church because, again, I had committed myself to continuing this graduate degree in spite of all that was happening around me and the racism that was impacting me at Purdue University. And I came home to be fueled by the people who raised me. And I remember one summer day that the Bible study, we had Bible study every day. When some black people talk about, I went to church from Sunday to Sunday, that was us. So we had Bible study every day at my church, and I went to this afternoon Bible study, and somehow the Bible study became about me. And I was called to the front of the church, and I was asked this question: why do you have locks? And not only was I asked this question, I was told that you know what that means, don't you? They didn't actually use the word locks, they used dreads, which is a European interpretation of what African people do to their head. So please don't ever call it dreading. It is called locks. They told me, do you want to be a Rastafarian? Are you professing to be a voodoo worshiper? Are you a devil worshiper? You know your hair stinks. And to cap it all off, I was told no man would want me looking like this. Now, mind you, I had never had a conversation with my pastor or anybody else about who I might want wanting me, but I was told that no man would want me looking like this. And if I wanted to worship in that place, I had to cut them off. What do we tell our children who are black? In that moment, all of the spirit left me. For the first time in my life, I was utterly broken. Now, I've had challenges before, and I had made difficult decisions about my life beforehand. But in that moment, when the people who I expected to give me refuge, when the people I expected to love me unconditionally, when the people I expected to teach me how to show up and manifest as best as possible in the world told me I could no longer be a part of their community, I was broken. And even as I stand here now, the trauma of this moment continues to live with me. And so I don't know how I made it in my car to the barbershop outside of the grace of God, because I'm pretty sure I could have hit many of pedestrians. I probably ran a number of red lights, but I made it to the barbershop because my sister did hair and they worked in a shop together. She wasn't there on that afternoon, and all I could utter to her friend was, "Cut it off." And he, in his own response to my trauma, attempting to get in touch with my sister, he was like, "I don't know what to do." And all I could say in that moment over and over and over again was, "Cut it off." And so that was the first time in my life that I had to learn how to put the pieces back together again. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, because we don't recognize the kind of trauma not only we are experiencing, but the kind of trauma that manifests in the lives of those who claim to love us the most. It was not the easiest process, but it did begin with a conversation with my mother. And some of you may be wondering, or even saying to yourself, there's no way in high hell that I would have cut my hair because these people around me told me to cut my hair. But when you live in a space where you cannot go home without going to church, you have to make a decision. You have to make a choice. and to choose what matters most. And in that moment, I chose my relationship with my family, but I did not choose to let it go. As I began to have a conversation with my mother, things that had built up from 20 years of growing up on the south side of Chicago began to unfold. And I began to realize and understand, to some degree, that even those in my church were dealing with this thing we called white supremacy. And this is the first time that I began to look at for myself, which became my doctoral research, white supremacist ideology. See, we think that only white people deal with whiteness. And we think that only those who practice white supremacist ideology have white skin. But the reality is, because of internalized racism, even those in my community who were reaching out to me were suffering. And they were suffering from an experience, and this is not in any way to validate what happened to me in that space. But they were suffering from living in Chicago, my pastor in particular, not being able to live in particular spaces throughout the city, where the railroad tracks were real, where the Eisenhower Expressway was a cutoff point for where blacks could and could not move in the city. And so part of their recovery from racism was attempting to put their children in spaces that had been denied to them. And what was coming up in their conversation with us was the reality of this racial segregation that has a new sociological term, like when a city in its history is so important that they start making up words for what is going on in the city. The hyper-segregation of Chicago was so ingrained in the culture and the history and the physical landscape of the place. How many of us have heard of residential segregation? So a lot of us in the room. And residential segregation, which is not any better than anything else, in layman's terms means that there are communities in which people are separated based on their racial or economic background. We have some of that here in Colorado Springs, but it's not too much. And it's not too much because we really just don't have a diverse population of people in Colorado Springs to even infiltrate different spaces. However, hypersegregation is racial segregation to like the umpteenth power. So not only are you living in specific neighborhoods, but if you can see down at the bottom, I don't know if the green shows up so well on the white, but if you can see this area, there are about 10 neighborhoods, maybe even more, in that area where you can go from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood and never see anyone outside of your race. From the convenience store to the doctors or the services provided by the city to the bus routes, you can never see anyone outside of your racial community. That's the Chicago I grew up in, where I was bused into a school system that allowed me to have Hispanic and white classmates. So for them, the chasm was so magnificent that they weren't even trying to process their own internalized racism. They were just trying to get me, whom they saw as like one of their hopes, because not only had I finished a bachelor's degree, unlike many of the other kids of my generation, but I went on and I got a master's degree, and hell, now we got somebody getting a PhD. There was nobody with PhDs in our church. There was not even a way to think about black people with PhDs. There was one professor from Chicago State who drove almost 100 miles to attend church with us, who was white, who had a PhD. And so this was a way to get their children access into a space that was not accessible before. So I had a very challenging position and a choice to make. And I began to make that choice, maybe not to their liking, but I began to make that choice to examine how white supremacist ideology was impacting communities of color. Because everybody else was talking about racism between blacks and whites, but they were not looking at how racism as a structure was eating away at even communities of color. And so when we talk about recovering, one of the things that we must understand, community. Secondly, understanding. There's a saying that hurt people, right? Have you ever heard of that? Hurt people hurt people. That when someone feels pain, a lot of times the way that we respond to pain is to project it onto someone else. And so, because my community was suffering, I was being forced to suffer. Because our community in Colorado Springs is suffering, our children in our education system, they're suffering because we haven't figured out collectively how to create and to move beyond our suffering that doesn't cause more suffering. This poem by Langston Hughes embodies that space of pick yourself up, move on, and get to the next level. Dr. Joy DeGruy articulates this as post-traumatic slave syndrome, where out of our protection for each other, out of what my pastor perceived to be a way to protect me from the larger society who would not see me as professional, the response was to cause more trauma. But unknowingly, because for her, it was protection. And so in this poem, you have a mother telling her son, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. And so life for you won't be a crystal stair. But you got to get up, you have to pick yourself up, and you got to still climb, you got to still rise. You have to keep going. And that's what we tell our children every day when they walk in the classroom and we say, well, you know, we don't have the best technology at Sierra, or we don't have as much money at Harrison as they do at Cheyenne Mountain. But we go, and we don't, you're right. I got young people at Sierra. But we also, as parents and educators, we can't just take the position of, well, this is what it is, so make sure that our kids are overcoming what it is. We have to be active in legislative decisions. We have to be active in community conversations. We have to learn to be active in terms of leveling the playing field. And not just telling our young people that we know life for you ain't gonna be no crystal stair. We have to learn how to begin to recover. So what does recovering look like? First, I'll say, It is a process that is never ending, particularly for our lifetime. Again, Dr. Moore pointed out that his presentation is not a certification in being able to use the N-word. It's not a way to say, you learned it, you got it, go do it. The reality is, recovering is an ongoing process. You won't hear from me in the next 10 minutes, because that's about what I have, or 5 rather. You won't hear from me how to recover, but at least to begin in recovering, because we will be doing this for a long time, because racism has been embedded in our culture for centuries. Ask yourself, are you a non-racist or an anti-racist? Anybody in here a non-racist? Non-racist, I see a few hands. I see a couple hands. Non-racist. Anybody in here anti-racist? I see more hands, but still a lot who sit in the middle, probably asking the question, like, what's the difference between them, right? I heard this explanation very recently. To be non-something means you are disengaged. I am a non-rapper. I'm a non-rapist. Which means I don't do that. I don't rape people, and I'm not getting ready to start doing that. I don't do that. So I don't do racism. How many of us have said this to ourselves and have professed this to others? I don't do racism. Like, I don't use those words. I don't engage in that activity. I don't do racist things. That's wonderful. But to be anti-racist means what? It is an active position of doing something against racism. There are enough people in the world who aren't doing jack about racism. But what we need in order to recover is to find those who are doing the work against the propelling of racism from generation to generation. So even changing our mindset and how we even think about this work is important. So if you leave with nothing else from this conversation today, begin to embrace what it might look like to be anti-racist, to engage yourself deliberately in the process of undoing racism in our culture and society. Next, allies versus accomplices. A lot of us use the language in this work as allies, right? But again, hearing very recently in my research, in my study, the new language of becoming an accomplice. I'll tell you a little anecdote. Some of you probably have heard it before. And it's about the difference between being invested versus committed. So a chicken comes to a pig on a farm one day, and the chicken is like, let's go make breakfast. Chicken and a pig on a farm saying, let's go make breakfast. And the pig was like, I'm okay with making breakfast, but what do you want to have? And the chicken was like, bacon and eggs. You know, I had bacon and eggs this morning, right? The pig turns to the chicken and says, see, you're invested, but I'm committed. And if you can't commit with me in the same way, then we can't have breakfast together. And that's the difference between being an ally versus an accomplice. Because an accomplice is going to jail with you when you have to shut down the highway because Black Lives Matter. As opposed to an ally who's sitting on their social media tweeting out, oh, they shut down the highway. That's the difference between being an accomplice versus an ally. Invest yourself in the things that you care about, but commit yourself to the things that have to, must, and for your life might even have to change. That is the work of recovering from racism. Lastly, as I get ready to wrap up, because I know you all need to leave to get to your next sessions, recognize that in and of yourself, that privilege begets oppression. That you cannot have oppression without privilege, and there is no such thing as privilege without oppression. They are, I'm trying to use a different word that I wouldn't use in my classroom. They're dependent upon each other. So forever, there are so many people saying, let's just give more people privileges. Let's just, even out the playing field that privilege is shared. But the reality is, wherever there's privilege, there will be a group of people that are oppressed. So the work has to be abolishing privilege. That we cannot keep and hold on to a privileged state of being and still continue to think that we're doing anti-oppression. And we have to recognize too, I have to recognize even of myself, that I am privileged. I finished my PhD. I obtained a tenure-track position and then was granted tenure. That is a very privileged space. But I also need to know that those privileges don't separate me, don't make me better than, don't create a situation in which I can forget about the other kids growing up on the south side of Chicago, on the east side of Colorado Springs, or in Missouri trying to get a college education where everything around you is telling you that it's not something you can obtain. So we have to do this work. There's a Cherokee proverb where a grandfather comes to his Cherokee son and he tells them, there are two wolves fighting, warring in you every day. One is a good wolf, and it lives off of joy, it lives off of happiness, empathy, sharing, collectiveness. And there's a bad wolf that lives off of evil, anger, despair, destruction. And the grandson looks at his grandfather and says, well, which one wins if they're warring inside of you every day? And the grandfather turns to his grandson and says, the one you feed. I could have been paralyzed by that moment in my life. I could have eaten their words about what my dreadlocks to them represented. I could have stopped my pursuit of education. I could have stopped finding myself to be worthy. But something in my spirit said, feed the good wolf. And in order to do that, it begins with forgiveness and moving beyond shame. There are many people in this room right now who live on multiple sides of this racism, whether it's I live in white privilege or I'm impacted by white privilege. In order to recover from racism, we have to begin with forgiveness, knowing that hurt people, and we also have to get ourselves out of the guilt of having privilege, because both of those will paralyze us. I too, Sing America, as well as you, And so we can work on recovering from racism together.
She's going to give you a presentation. I need to get out of the way because the light.